Welcome, everyone, to another broadcast of The Soul of the Everyman on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are podcasts. Find them at artistfirst.com. We welcome your questions and comments. Please use DJ at artistfirst.com. And now your hosts, Michael and Margaret Lyons.
And thank you very much, Z-Man, and I'm Michael Lyons.
And I'm Margaret.
And welcome to The Soul of the Everyman, where the points don't matter.
Okay.
We haven't done that one in a while.
Alrighty. I didn't know we even had points.
See?
What's the point?
What's the point? What is the point?
What is the point?
Now we're getting sidetracked here. Tonight we have a point.
Okay.
And a hat would cover it nicely. At least I have one. Tonight we're going to talk about a topic that you came up with a couple, 3 days ago. Just sort of I'm not sure how you came up with it. You can talk to that yourself. But I thought it was extremely interesting when you brought this point up, and I'll let you make put the point out there. But when you said this, you posed this question to me, and I said, yeah, why? So with that sort of scattered introduction, want to essay your point?
Well, just thinking, and the question just pops up. What is ego? I mean, really, what is it? We all kind of throw the word around easily, and we assume that everyone knows what it means.
Oh, and we've been told a lot what it means too, so yeah.
You know, and I sat there and I was like, okay, wait a minute. We always identify with something. That's just kind of part of how we operate. But that identification, the process where we do the identification becomes very interesting. How do I say this? You know, when you're young, that people tell you, oh, yes, you're supposed to go out and find out who you are. Explore things. And at least in Western society, that's what they say. Eastern society will tell you who you are.
We'll tell you who you are. Well, I mean, but let's not lose check. This is a very seminal question. When you said this to me, you say, well, you know, what is? Basically, the question is, what is the ego? You know, what is it? And then I came back and I said, and why do we have one? You know, why do people have an ego? And so the basic definition of what is this thing, because it is sort of a thing. It's sort of a thing. It's sort of an entity. It's
a concept that we identify with, which should make it really important to understand what it is.
I think we have to go deeper on that one. You know, let me put back to you something here. So you said just a moment ago that we identify. We kind of want to identify with things, but you know, wouldn't we all, and you know, Tolle and many other philosophers and many people throughout history have come up against the ego and said this is a bad thing, or this is a thing that can, as Gautama Buddha said, cause suffering. The cause of all suffering is this sort of overarching, and now we've identified, given a name, this ego, this idea that things shouldn't be as they are, and that somehow my identity is given to me by these things or by these circumstances. I'm rich, I'm tall, I'm handsome, I'm pretty.
Okay, let me just go back for a second. Buddha basically said all life is suffering. And there is a way out of the suffering. And that's when he introduced the Eightfold Path. But the Eightfold Path, without him saying it, is a way of taking a step outside of your ego.
Right.
Especially if you are very mentally invested in trying to do things, because the Eightfold Path pretty much is a mental application of trying to step outside of your concept of you.
Yeah, who you think you are.
Mm-hmm.
But then let's go back a little bit further. You mentioned it briefly, but I want to just reiterate. Where does the ego come from? Why is it there? And I would postulate that we are not born with it. When you look upon an infant or a small child, they don't have, or if they have any kind of ego at all, it isn't this fully developed sort of entity. They start out just being. When you look at an infant, newborn or very young, either pre-verbal or initially, starting to learn to talk or walk or all these things, toddler, you don't see a lot of ego there. What you do see is a lot of being there. And we've all had the experience of looking at an infant and connecting with them on a non-egoic level. And maybe you don't put it in exactly those terms, but you don't have to identify yourself to an infant. You just are there, and they're there, and everything's great, and I love you and you love me. People get the same sort of feeling from their pets. There's no judgment. There's no ego there. There's no, who are you to me? Can you do this for me? Are you great? Are you powerful? Are you handsome? Are you pretty? No, you just are. Your dog or your pet or your very young child looks at you and just loves you unconditionally, and you find that intensely gratifying. People who interact with their pets or interact with very young children find this sort of incredible, beautiful, wholesome connection with them at a non-egoic level. You're reminded of the fact that you're a being at that point when you have a pet in front of you or you have an infant in front of you. Because why? Because they're not looking at you and judging you and putting you in a box and identifying you and figuring out whether you can do this or do that. No, it's just you, me, and everything's wonderful. That is where they are at that point. And at some point further along, some sort of turning point there, all of a sudden this ego comes in. And you said, and this is why it was so interesting, is why? Why does that happen?
Well, okay. You say that you don't think people are born with an ego, but I believe that there are certain tendencies that a soul comes into incarnation and they are born with it.
Interesting.
They get triggered or remembered impulses, maybe. I don't know how else to say that. The way that they respond to a need, suddenly the baby's hungry, what is their response to it? And that's when you begin to see the foundations of what is in front of you. If the child is hungry and is patient, it will cry to let you know it's hungry. But we all know, if we've had multiple children, that different children have more patience than others.
Yeah. Well, let's stop there for a second. So you said something very interesting there that, okay, so some circumstance occurs, as you mentioned, a need. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm tired, I'm bored, whatever it is.
It's usually a need of the body.
So, and that's even better. It's a need of the body, let's say, that starts off this thing. And it evokes a response, and you said it just now, from the soul, which is, we should probably at this moment, or very shortly, define those concepts, because whenever we do, there's always this sort of confusion about spirit, body, and soul. But I like that. I like that a lot, because spirit is being, and spirit, as we know, being, consciousness, contains the ego. But when you're first incarnated, perhaps the best way to look at it is that the ego is latent. Maybe not there, but not triggered or reminded. I love that you said that the ego is reminded by some need.
The soul is reminded of a need.
Right, not the ego, right? The soul.
The soul is reminded of a need, and its tool in order to get what it wants is usually an ego.
So let's. This is great stuff.
Okay.
This is great stuff, because the soul as the fundamental vehicle of the ego seems to be very, very right, because as we all know, spirit is eternal, but the soul is a instantiation of being for a period of time in an incarnation. You have body, and people always say this: I'm body and soul. They do go together. Being is eternal. Being doesn't need body or soul, but body needs soul and soul needs body. If you know what I mean.
Well, we are a tripart being.
Yes.
Our spirit, soul, body. And the soul incorporates the mind, the emotions, and the ability to choose, which is your will. So a person can have a very strong will or not. That expresses itself where the ego understands that there's a way to get what I want. And so it begins into what small children do, which is tantrums, screaming.
I hate doing this, but that's really key. Maybe egos are born of wants. We've mentioned needs and wants. Sort of those things evoke thoughts and emotions, and then they ball themselves up into ego, or they feed that latent ego. They reawaken the monster, if you will.
Well, it is, if you go by Tolle, you understand that is part of the pain body.
Yeah.
And that energy runs through all human personalities, and if it finds someone it can dwell in, it will go there. So to be aware that these things can trigger pain body presence. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
That's a great little turn of phrase, the pain body presence.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I like that a lot. We should probably coin that or something. Patent it. It may have already been.
Yeah. Pain body, people experience it first before they're even aware that there's a difference between them and that pain body presence. To be able to distinguish between the two, frankly, is a foundation for sanity in a human being. Because you realize that, well, no, that's the emotion I'm feeling, or there is much more going on than just what I really want. Those are steps into a maturity. If you're talking about an infant who's very limited in the way that he or she can communicate, then usually you get a tantrum because they feel this and they don't know what else to do, and have not been shown a way to handle what this actually is.
So just puzzling this through a little bit. So we start with an infant, a being, certainly a consciousness that has within it a soul and is incorporated incarnate within a body. So there we are, any one of us, all of us, in this infantile form, and then within that consciousness, that soul, mind, body connection, that whole idea, or rather consciousness and mind and body connection, you have this latent socket, or this latent ability, this egoic capacity. Okay, so there's a capacity for ego, and it instantly kind of seizes upon a need or a desire or some sort of physicality or perhaps some sort of emotion, and so that energy rises up, or that need evokes some sort of a pain and some sort of a response, as you said, We have a stimulus where we're hungry or we're tired or we're cranky or whatever, and the emotion rises up of anger or fear or any of those things, and this egoic, sort of latent egoic capacity, maybe immature at this point, seizes upon that and says, I know what to do. I can figure out, I'm going to get this need addressed. So this might be the basis, we could say that this is the basis of why it's there, because it gets things done. It helps you survive.
Right.
There's the problem, the thing about the ego, you say, well, why do we have one? And, if you look from the point of view of, over millions of years of evolution of an organism, the ego is there, or the latent capacity is there within the being, within this incarnate entity. It's there because it gets things done. It allows you to channel a certain amount of energy towards addressing a need. So in that way, it has a use. It
Right.
definitely has a use.
Right. And as you mature, the things that you want to interact with, or as you said, get things done, but it's usually an exploration of yourself, the environment around you, and the people that are in that environment. So all that complicates your experience, and the ego wants to express itself. Or rather, let me put it this way. The soul wants to express itself. And it had utilized the ego before, so it's sitting there going, well, maybe I should do this again. I want to express certain things. Let me use the ego again. But the ego is a limited tool for the soul, believe it or not.
Well, I like that. I like the fact that you classify the ego as a tool, because it has a utility, and it sort of instinctively seizes upon a need or that emotional energy or those thoughts or whatever, and because it's there, much like a reflex. I mean, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are ingrained within the structure of a human being in the body. There are certain reflexes that are ingrained within the person. You can, they've done a lot of experiments like this, but just to mention one, you can show a picture or even a silhouette of a snake to an infant who's never ever seen a snake before, and they will draw back and show signs of fear. Why? Well, in much the same way that we are averse to certain noxious stimuli, it was very important for a proto-human, or for a being, for a body rather, that had some sort of utility to survive, that it avoids certain things. And this is wired in. You say, I'm afraid of falling. Why? Because falling can kill you. I'm afraid of snakes. Without knowing what it is, just the silhouette alone triggers some sort of basic survival level response. So the ego is in that category, in the sense that it acts to address certain survival level needs: hunger, fear, channeling emotions like anger and so on. So there it is, and it gets started up. And then, as you mentioned, the soul itself, because we are much more complicated than just a simple animal. So the soul is involved in the sense that the soul brings with it back a certain degree of what it needs to get done this time, this incarnation, what it's here to learn, what it's here to experience, the experiential nature of the soul, the relationship nature of the soul, seizes upon the ego, which is what you just said. It's a tool, and says, well, gosh, here it is, and it works great, and it gets me things, and it gets me fed, and so let's use it. Let's use it for all kinds of other things, to get myself money or prestige or respect or attention. And so the ego becomes when the old saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, everything looks like an egoic problem, or an egoic something I can use the ego on. So it gets to be habitual, that the go-to thing is the ego. And then the ego starts to reverse that on you and say, well, this is what you are. Whenever this happens and you go to the ego and the ego gives you the answer, the ego says a little stronger, a little stronger. This is who you are. This is who you are. This is who you are.
See, what the ego says is, see, you're discovering who you are. You're me.
You're
ego.
Me. It holds up the mirror and says, look, this is who you are.
Right. And it's very interesting because that's the first step in beginning to engage with this world. This is a learning experience too, because you've been narrowed down to this kind of thought form, and you're sort of losing your understanding of experiencing this life, which is the soul's main purpose, is to interact and experience what is going on down here. When you narrow it down just to trigger and response, habitual patterns that you've decided that, well, this is who I am, you continue narrowing yourself down and down. And I think that that's really interesting, because there is a point where the soul sits there and goes, wait a minute, I'm not being fulfilled. And that's when the questions start. Everything that it had formed to manage things now is not quite working. I am not as fulfilled as I thought I would be.
Well, and isn't that interesting? Because the ego, you just said it, but I want to kind of reiterate what I heard you say. The ego narrows and narrows and narrows things, so it also cages you, it boxes you, it kind of puts walls up around you, around your experience, because it says, well, if we are this, then we can't be that. So it has to be this and that.
Well, pretty much with your permission. See, that process of figuring it out, you're giving permission for the ego to take over.
Right. Giving permission. You enable the ego.
Correct.
But then, the ego is not that great at this stuff. So it manages to cause suffering, to cause pain, to perhaps in essence as like a feedback loop. When the ego is engaged, it's engaged to satisfy a need. It doesn't do a very good job of that. So it actually leaves you with more suffering, with more needs, which you then have to re-engage the ego. So it becomes sort of a runaway positive feedback loop. The ego causes problems which make you engage the ego and identify with it more.
I believe that's called an addiction.
Well, it becomes like an addiction, but I think it also, if you go back to sort of Tolle's way of looking at the ego, this is the pain body. It acquires a entity, a life of its own, which is driven by the fact that it causes suffering. And in causing suffering, it gets more attention, it gets more energy, it gets more emotion, causes more suffering. It starts to loom larger and larger in your consciousness. It starts to cloud your ability to be, because it crowds out so much of experience based on, well, this is not you and this is not you, and you have to do this and you must do that. And, if you want this to happen, then you must do these things, and this, you must pay attention to me and give me all the energy and give me all the time, and this is who you are. That mirror becomes not just a way of seeing yourself, but a way of seeing nothing else but yourself.
Yeah, I'd say it's the beginnings of a narcissistic tendency.
Absolutely.
Because all you're doing is you're concerned with yourself completely.
Concerned with yourself completely. So the ego gets out of control. I mean, if we go back a little bit, I think we sort of understand why we have an ego. It has a utility. This is interesting. Again, much like emotion and much like the mind, the thoughts, the ego is a necessary component for survival.
Yes.
And used in the proper way, your mind is an incredibly powerful tool to analyze, to predict, to understand, to explore. But it can also become toxic, endlessly giving you thoughts, endlessly giving you things which could not be or which must be or cannot be, all this sort of endless preoccupation with the future, with the past. Emotions, I did a lot of studies on emotion, and with Dr. Paul Ekman and many of his things, and we won't go into it, but emotion is, Tolle says this too, is energy. And that energy is really, really important. It prepares your body and your physiology to survive under certain circumstances. So why anger is important, why fear is important, why happiness is important, all the actual emotion of joy or happiness, if you will. All these things are important because they allow your physiology to properly respond to what is going on around you. So you can see why this is a tool, thoughts, why emotions are important. They're energy, they power things, they get you through survival. And then you have the ego, and the ego can be thought of as a distinct thing, but it can also be thought of as something which marshals thoughts and emotions and converts them perhaps into actions or into sort of channeling these thoughts and emotions into a purpose. You could look on the ego as being a component of the body's soul mechanism, which helps it survive by channeling these sort of energetic bursts of emotion and these analytical thoughts into something which can actually take effect on the situation which might be arising. And it has to be exigent. It has to be something that happens rather quickly and rather reflexively. So that whole sort of mechanism there has tremendous utility. There's a bunch of really, really good, finely honed, thousands and hundreds of thousands of generations of honed up tools. But they can kind of take over. They can kind of take over in the sense that they become all, as we said earlier, if all you have is these three tools, then all of a sudden everything looks like it needs to be thought about or emoted about or, ego identified with, or, it just...
Well, what I find interesting is that the culture itself has narrowed down the idea that intelligence is everything.
Mm.
Okay, so they use that as a gauge. Now, not to say that not to be intelligent does give you some advantages. That's absolutely true. But this general assumption that the higher your intelligence, the more of a moral person or your character has got to be really good, which is absurd. Because it I guess the best way to describe it is, we've all taken PSATs and SATs, and you get scores on your SATs. So yes, you get a high score on the SAT. It shows that you are capable of thinking in logical ways, and in a lot of university settings as well as in business and hierarchies, you're able to navigate your way through. But it doesn't mean that you have any kind of moral character. It just means you're capable of scoring higher. But people have a tendency to believe that because you're intelligent or you have a higher IQ, you're a better person than the average person. And no.
No, hardly. But I think that's an egoic conceit right there. The ego wants to, well, let's bring in. We have a quote here from our buddy Tolle, and it's germane here. Would you like me to read it, or do you want to read it?
You can read it.
Well, because what you just mentioned is exactly kind of what he talked about
Do
there.
you want me to read it? I'll read it.
Sure.
All you need to know and observe in yourself is this. Whenever you feel superior or inferior to anyone, that's the ego in you.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And this is what we were saying. This foundation of believing that just because you are considered more intelligent, you should be a better human being on the scale.
Well,
or even worse, everybody should bow down to you.
Right.
Because you are the smartest person in the room, and we should all listen to you.
Right.
Which is also quite a fallacy.
And this is not just the only way. I mean, certainly intellect or intelligence is used as one way for the ego to make itself feel superior. So, well, I'm smarter than this one, or this one's dumber than me, and so therefore, I should be in charge, or even if they do something, I just look down and I say, oh, they don't know what you're talking about.
Right, and Jordan Peterson's phrase for that is the wounded intellectual pride.
I like that.
Where
you could expound upon it. I haven't heard about him say that.
Yeah, where he's basically saying that the person is worshiping the intellect. And because you're worshiping the intellect, the very fact that reason should be telling you that, yeah, you're smart, but that doesn't mean you have all the answers, doesn't even register. Because you're worshiping the intellect and making it the default program of trying to figure out who is worthy and who isn't. The minute you go into that vein, you're going into worship.
Well, and interestingly enough, again, that's the same sort of thing. The worthiness. Okay, we often talk about the fact that the ego is all about who's right, who's wrong, or who's worthy, or who's not worthy, or who is superior and who is inferior, who should be in charge. And we had a couple 3 weeks ago a show where people are always, I think it was about stupidity, where people always overestimate their own ability to do something. Well, what informs you of that is this egoic conceit that people will always say that they're smarter than the other one, because to acknowledge, to use reason to say, well, I'm probably not the smartest person in the room. That it's unlikely, if you are really being analytical about something, if you asked an AI and said, well, am I the smartest person in the room? And the AI said, well, that's unlikely, because the larger the room gets, and if the room is the Earth, or the room is a university, or the room is whatever size you want it to be, if you're not the only person in the room, you're probably, it becomes less and less and less likely. But the ego says, no, of course you're the smartest person in the room. You're smart and handsome, and people like you. Just like the old saying from the Truman Show. The ego wants you to always be the smartest person in the room. It wants you to, even if you're not in charge, say, well, the people who are in charge are idiots, and I'm just tolerating them because, I could tell them how to do it better, but no one ever asks me. And so that wounded intellectual pride sort of beautifully comforts itself by saying, well, all these idiots that I have to put up with all the time, they're all unable to do what I can do, and I'm right, and I know they're wrong, and I'll just humor them. That whole lovely, warm, self-referential self-worship, right? Who's being worshipped here? You. You're worshiping yourself
through your intellect.
You're
basically trying to prove that you are superior, and therefore you should deserve more attention.
Yes. And what's the puncturing of this, of course, is what the ego, what's kryptonite to the ego is humility. Is actually using your intellect to say, well, if I if I am in a room of people and I don't know anything about them, the ego says you assume that you're the smartest person in the room. The humble and human way of looking at it is say, well, I don't know anything about these people. I have no idea whether they're smarter than me or not. Maybe I should just, wait and, be a little humble and say, well, maybe they've got good ideas. That's not what the ego says. The ego says, where do bad ideas come from? Bad ideas come from other people. That's the ego talking. And when I lay my golden tones of wisdom on somebody, well, obviously any sort of disagreement is because they're Philistines and they don't understand me.
Well, yeah, that's pretty much the bubble.
The bubble, exactly.
That the ego forms, and our society encourages that.
Oh my God, the current. I mean, you want to talk about the ability to stroke the ego is perhaps unparalleled in human society than what we have today, because you can find as quickly as you wish, you can find a place where you are the smartest person in the room, or at least everyone will tell you that you are, and that's such an inviting, warm place for the ego. It'll go back there every time.
Of course, because it's being fed.
Being fed.
And that's the very interesting thing right now, is that particular mindset is being fed by especially communications, any kind of social media or even advertisements, television. There's a lot of ego-feeding stuff. And that's the thing that the advertisers have learned, is that as long as they feed somebody's ego, somebody is going to pay attention to the advertising and maybe possibly buy it because it means this. It means I'm better than somebody else. So it's very interesting to observe, and it would be far more useful if one can observe it in oneself.
Yeah. Well, what you just said is there was another quote which I didn't bring in here, but Tolle talked about the fact that the ego is not merely the unobserved emotion or the unobserved thoughts. It's more than that. It is an entity unto itself which uses the fact that thoughts are unobserved or emotions are unsupervised,
right,
and gathers them in and literally, if it becomes toxic, uses them for its own purposes. And this sounds sort of creepy and weird, but the ego, and unfortunately this happens to many people over the course of their lives, the ego becomes an entity, sometimes an incessant critical voice, sometimes a sort of a driving need to prove oneself over and over again. Who are you proving yourself to? Nobody. Nobody is. Your ego is telling you that you need to prove yourself to everybody, whereas everyone else around you is like, why is this guy, jumping up and down over and over again to prove himself? We don't care. But the ego tells you that everyone does care, that they're all waiting for you and wanting you to prove yourself and denigrating you if you don't and judging you.
Well, that's what makes this particular quote by Tolle very relevant. If any feelings of inferiority or superiority, that's your ego.
Exactly.
I mean, you just go right there. It's like, oh, that's my ego.
Right.
And to acknowledge that, because that's the next step after the acknowledging that you're seeing that you're feeling superior over someone or inferior to someone. Actually take a step back and see what's unfolding around me. Because when a person is continually trying to say, I've been slighted, that this person is talking down to me, and it may or may not be the case, but the response that you give is what matters. Because you're feeling that this other person, if you're feeling like you're being denigrated, then you feel that the person that's saying this to you is somehow his opinion is worth something.
Right.
Or the opposite, of course, is true. But what are you actually doing? Because when a person is in that spin, it's very interesting because everybody else around them can see it, even though they think this is just an internal battle that they're having with themselves. Everyone around them, especially the ones that you love, can see it. And the immediate reaction is to try to soothe this person, talking them down off the wall before they explode.
Exactly. But, even in perfect strangers, you'll meet somebody. This is sort of, we can just go into examples, and there's millions and millions of them. And it's before we go into that, it's very tempting when you meet someone to, as the ego would do, automatically try to make assumptions about whether they're inferior or superior to you. This is very, very egoic. But even if you are somewhat of an observer of your own being, and you can see these things in yourself, when you see them in another, portraying this sort of egoic behavior, don't automatically, the ego will rise up again immediately, try to make you feel superior to them. Look at them. Look, they're so bound up in all this, in all of their, in all their nonsense, or all their trying to prove themselves. The ego is very, very insidious. It's very subtle. It can use anything, even your desire to be enlightened, or your desire to be,
whatever you want.
Whatever you want.
Okay.
Exactly.
That's how it was first initiated when you were young.
Exactly.
And that's how it has evolved.
Yes.
It has figured out ways to try to manage your attention, manage keeping your attention on it,
yes,
no matter what it is that you want.
Right. Even the desire to not have an ego is something the ego can use.
Yes.
So, but before we go too deeply into that, I think you raised a really, really, really good point in that when a person is engaged in an internal egoic battle, it is not something which is unapparent to those around you. They can feel at least the turmoil. And that's how an internal egoic battle will kick off external conflict. Okay? When someone is engaged in and is fighting their own pain body, their own internal demons, we all know, we all have our own sort of internal demons, if many, many people do at least. That when you bring that energy into the room, you're radiating it. It is not contained within you. It is certainly happening within you. It is not actually happening in reality, but in the effect of an egoic battle within a person that enters into a social situation is immediate, and it travels, at the speed of light almost. It can. We probably all have had the experience where somebody walks into a room and all of a sudden the mood changes like snap. Wow, it went from 0 to 60 in here because somebody entered into the room with a whole bunch of, egoic, emotional thought baggage. And everybody can sense it instantly. Why? Why can we? Because it's radiating from the person. It's not contained within. Yes, the whole genesis of it is within, but this the sensitivity to the egoic energy is another reason why people have egos. It's also like an antenna. You can use your ego to pick up other people's egoic radiations, and then if you are observing it, you can say, okay, this one's in this one's in that. And as Margaret just said, don't use that as just another vehicle to feed that ego and say, oh yeah, I can see. You have to, even that can become a vehicle to entrap you in another sort of ego spin. However, the ability to see the internal conflict is incredibly important. And if you observe it in others, you can then say, do I do that? No, not me. I wouldn't do. Yes, it can become a vehicle to, in seeing this in others, it can become a vehicle, and this is how psychotherapy works in essence, to see it within oneself. To say, well, do I, moi, do I have these terrible things happening? Well, yes, you do, and that whole way of using psychotherapy, or a way to examine these egoic entities through dialogue, perhaps, or through experiential. I think Peterson does this a lot, where he brings people through their traumas again and again, and it sort of diffuses them. Well, what you're doing is letting them see that it really isn't happening, see that it really isn't hurting. And you do this through this sort of empathetic and dialogue technique. That's because you can see it in the other, and you can start to see it in yourself.
And that's the key, is to be able to recognize when it's happening, because usually we are creatures of habit, and we will go through a stimulus reaction before we're even aware of doing it. And that's the most interesting part, trying to truly be the observer of oneself. It's very tricky.
Well, the Dalai Lama, right? I mean, you could go into that a bit, how he counsels people to do that.
Well, I was going to talk more about something else.
Oh, go ahead, go.
When this is beginning, like as we said, back to when you were an infant, in the human being there is this soul cry to be heard. And it's very basic. I think it's so basic that people overlook it immediately. It becomes very obvious in the infant because the baby cries to be heard, because it needs the recognition, either for hunger or discomfort. But many times it's like it doesn't want to be alone. Am I alone here? And it cries and says, oh, there. That warmth is there. That person is there. The soul cry to be recognized is foundational for every human being. And if that is denied, that's when that internal panic sets in. But it's also because of that natural human yearning to be heard. That is taken advantage of by the ego, because the ego wants also to be heard. So it says, yes, I want to be heard. You want to be heard. We're the same.
Yeah.
And that is the beginning of the foundation for it. This sort of came up because I was listening to a rendition of Voila, the song, and I wanted to know what the lyrics meant in English. And when I started reading it, I realized that if you could put into words that yearning to be seen and heard, that song encapsulates it beautifully, expresses it beautifully. The artistry of it is beautiful. And the rendition of it, it is the soul's cry. That's why the soul inevitably, the people that listen to it, wind up crying. Because that yearning is so deep within the human that we can identify it even when we may not even know what the lyrics mean. People are crying because it's a pure cry, a pure call. See me. I'm here. Voila. See me. And that's what kind of set off that thought process. Because when you are working with your ego and you're doing it that way, where it's piece by piece, you don't realize that every doubt and every fear that you carry begins to tear you apart. It does damage to you. And that cry of, see me, I'm here, voila, is a cry for wholeness. Wholeness without doubt or fear. And that is something that is so intrinsic to our life path here. Just realizing that your soul and the ego are not the same thing. And that yearning for fulfillment is not really an ego cry. It's really a soul cry. And the ego wants to be in control of the soul, your attention.
That's excellent. That's really good, because it's exactly right. The soul is incarnate to be heard. Manifestation. The word is the vehicle of manifestation. And so when you are incarnate, you participate in creation. You become instantiated as an entity within creation, and your word and your will is the vehicle by which you can effectively become a creator within creation. So there you are, and you want to be heard. You want to be recognized. There's a basic human need for relationship and for recognition and to be heard.
Yes.
And the ego rears up and says, well, like every other need that you have, I can fulfill this. It literally hijacks this need to be heard. And interestingly enough, Margaret, what you just said is so good, because the ego says, I'll listen to you and I'll tell you what to do.
Right.
And then you are me, and you should listen to me. So it goes from I'll listen to you and I'll help you to I'll tell you what to do and you are me. And so the ego is a hijacking it hijacks your thoughts to be thinking about it all the time. It hijacks your emotions to feed it and to power it. It hijacks your will in one regard by lulling it to sleep and saying, no, I'll take care of that, I'll take care of that, I'll take care of that. And so this idea of being heard, when all you're doing is talking to an egoic entity within your head, or that's talking to you within your head, you're taking what should be a channel of fulfillment, your word, and you're being heard, and you're participating in actual creation and actual reality, and it's being hijacked and sort of turned into this internal gyre, into this internal nothing ever happens, but you're just talking to yourself within your mind and your ego with your emotions, and it's all spinning, and you're not actually doing anything. You're not actually getting any new experience. You're walling off all new experience. You're actually not getting any, you're not actually participating in creation. So it becomes very toxic in that regard. That's really, really good. Is that the ego hijacks the actual purpose of the soul.
Right. But I guess maybe the best way to put it is the ego is not totally bad.
No.
This is the, when we're saying hijacking, whatnot, it
sounds bad.
It sounds bad.
It does.
But the ego is actually a gift that humanity has been given. And there's a phrasing in the Bible, and in essence what it is a gift given to you. you need to bring this talent or gift to fruition and multiply it out in the world. But a gift misused by you turns into your enemy. And that is an amazing thought.
Yeah, I agree. The ego is a two-edged sword. It's a gift that can become, a crippling thing.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that you're actually fighting your own ego when you misuse it. And I believe we've reached the end of our hour.
I think we have.
So I'm Margaret.
And I'm Michael.
And thank you for listening.